Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to virtual events. Thank you for tuning in to the Fine Arts Work Center's Tuesday evening virtual event series. Looks like we've got lots of attendees popping in, so we'll just give a second for people to get in online and joining us. Okay, so as people are coming, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So if you attendees happen to lose connection, not to worry, just take a deep breath and go back to that unique link that you were sent when you registered, and you'll be able to just click that and rejoin back in. There are a couple of features for you to use during the event this evening. Depending on if you're on a phone or a tablet or computer, it'll be either at the top of your screen or at the bottom of your screen, but there'll be a chat feature. And if you could use that, please, if you have any comments during the event. If you have any questions, please use the feature that is Q&A. If you do have any technical difficulties throughout this event, use the Q&A. I'm going to keep an eye on that, and I will be able to private message you back if you have technical issues or concerns. And let's see. I think that's all of the housekeeping that I have for you in this moment. So we are going to have a couple of introductions here to get us started. So I'm going to pass the screen over to Director of Education Programs for the Fine Arts Work Center, Kelly Groom, and she'll get you oriented to what's going to be happening this evening. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm Kelly Groom. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are thrilled to celebrate Paul Lisicky's newest book, Later, with Paul, Elizabeth McCracken, Polly Burnell, and Oren Sherman. I'm going to do some brief introductions and then turn it over to Elizabeth. So Paul Lisicky's 6 books include The Narrow Door, Unbuilt Projects, and Lawn Boy. His awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, NEA, and the Fine Arts Work Center. He is an associate professor in the MFA program at Rutgers University Camden, and he lives in Brooklyn. His 6th book, Later, which we celebrate tonight, was just published by Grey Wolf in March. Elizabeth McCracken is the author of 6 books, most recently Bowl Away. She's received grants and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, among others. She holds the James A. Michener Chair in Fiction at the University of Texas, Austin, and her new collection of stories, The Souvenir Museum, comes out next year. Polly Burnell has lived and worked in Provincetown since 1986, receiving a fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center in 1993-94. That was followed shortly thereafter by a 2-person exhibition at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum with Irene Lipton, curated by Donald Beal. She has served on the Provincetown Historic Commission in many capacities, and her work is represented by Berta Walker Gallery. Oren Sherman is best known locally for his Provincetown and Truro paintings, which appear on multiple covers of the L.L. Bean catalog and Yankee magazine. He has been designing exclusive artwork for a variety of clients, including Steuben Glass, PepsiCo, Disney, the Olympics, Visa, and many more. An alumnus and professor at Rhode Island School of Design, Oren has partnered with manufacturers and companies across the country, developing artwork as the essence of brand identity. So Elizabeth, I'm turning it over to you.
So much, Kelly. Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and I am so thrilled to be here talking to my very beloved friend, Paul Lisicky, who is a magnificent writer and also a lovely person, to have a very Provincetown evening, to support the Fine Arts Rec Center and to talk with our guests, Oren, Sherman, and Burnell. And Paul is going to start with a little reading. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then bring in Oren and Polly. And also, if you've got questions that you want to ask in the chat, I will be keeping an eye out for that, and I will ask them. And I'm getting used to Zoom and the fact that I'm talking to Paul, but at the moment he's completely invisible to me on my screen.
Oh, wow.
Oh, there you are.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, so nice
Hey,
to be
thank
here.
you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for being here on a particularly warm night in the Northeast, if you're tuning in from the Northeast. In the briefest sense, Provincetown, later is set in the Provincetown of the early 1990s when I arrived in town as a fellow of the Fine Arts Work Center. So, in part, it's the story of my arrival at a point in the history of town when the town was a haven and refuge for people with HIV and AIDS. So it's a personal story, it's my story, but it's also the story of a town and how its inhabitants kept one another lifted and energized and laughing and awake during a time of emergency. So I'm going to read just the shortest section before Elizabeth asks me some questions. And I've never read this passage before, and Elizabeth was really terrific in suggesting it. So it's to my mind, a different voice from some of the voices in the book, but you'll get a sense of the tone of the whole thing here. And this is called Perfect. Perfect. Somewhere in the world, someone says Provincetown, and they say it the way they might say Paris. The tone has good intentions, but the deadly earnestness of it shuts its door on too many truths. It can try your patience when you've put in your time in town. That voice refuses complexity. That voice leaves no room for any trait that doesn't support the myth of the perfect home. There is a place for us, somewhere, a place for us. It doesn't want to know about full to capacity septic tanks or boredom or power outages or fights at town meeting or the huge gaps between communities. Any of the sacrifices and difficulties of those who choose to live in a place that's hard to get to, expensive to get to, isolated in summer, even more so in winter when fewer planes fly in from Boston and everyone depends on 2 bus departures and arrivals a day. That voice doesn't acknowledge all the forces that want to make money from it, chew it up, spit it out. How much does it cost to rent the most modest retail space in summer? 30,000, 60,000? If I have to go one more night to free movies at the Whaler where people scoop up free popcorn from a trash barrel, I'll choke myself. No wonder Polly and I take drives up Cape, lumping through the strip malls of dreary I&O Road in Hyannis. Then the poet Frank Bedard stands behind the podium of the Work Center's common room. He reads his long poem, Ellen West, for the 20 or so people in those chairs, and his urgent voice is the inner life incarnate, and we wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I'll never say Provincetown in that voice, the perfect world, the dream of. That's for people who want to stay where they are, in a place of routine and duty, which they don't have to inhabit fully. They need others to take their chances for them.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for suggesting that.
I love that passage. I feel like the Whaler Lounge to Frank Bedard describes what the early 90s, particularly at the Work Center, was like. And the book opens with you coming to Provincetown with your mother for your first year fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center. and it's a, you know how I feel about this book. It's a remarkable book, and it is so layered when it comes to time, and it's about place and sex and death and the town itself at the heart of it. And one of the things that seems particularly amazing to me is that, so it starts with you arriving in 1991 to a place where you then have a really long relationship with. You still have a relationship with Provincetown, and you and come back and visit and stay with Polly and stay at the work center. When you were writing the book, how did you unpick all the versions of Provincetown you knew from your memories? Because the book has the feeling of immediate memories, and yet they begin almost 30 years ago.
Right. I mean, the true difficulty of this book was trying to find borders around it, like trying to find constraints, because I knew I couldn't write a book that was 30 years in duration. It would be too much. And it occurred to me maybe, a year or so, or not even that, into the writing of the book, that I really had to cordon it off, and cordon it off to the most intense time, which for me was between the years 1991 and 94, those years before protease inhibitors changed the landscape of town. So yeah, I wanted to unpack those times. Probably those times were the most intense moments of my life. It felt like, all the different facets of my life, myself, were coming together. My desire to be an artist, my desire to finally inhabit myself as a queer person, my desire to be a part of a community. Before this time, with the exception of grad school, I'd felt so much a loner. And as soon as I got to town, I think the immediate thrill, aside from the fact that I could be like a young gay man finally, was the fact that I was living as I'd come as a loner, and, I walked down the street and I could say hi to people, and people said hi back to me. And I felt a sense of welcome and inclusion, and also could extend that. And there was something about that experience, like all of those desires coming together, that it was like the adult grows at that moment, even though, a lot of our behavior during those years, during my early years in town, was silly and wacky and less than adult on the surface. But yeah, it was like the hugest deal to be a participant in a place where, I could have sort of casual friendships or say hello to people whose names I didn't know. It felt incredibly nourishing on a day-to-day level. And in a way, it felt like art itself. I mean, I think the difficulty of that time for me was that, to sit back in my studio and write just didn't have the full-bodiedness of a simple walk down Commercial Street from Pearl Street to the West End and back, and to see who was out and about, and to see who I could say hi to.
I was thinking about you talking about adults versus children, that there's that line in the book that I love about between grown-up and child, who wouldn't choose to be the latter?
Well, exactly, because there's still, there's possibility ahead of you when you choose the latter. And if you say you're an adult, you have to live with the ramifications of your choices, right? Like, your story is already made. And I think the dream of Provincetown is that you can disrupt or throw that old story behind and start yourself anew.
I want to share a picture of you from that time. Did that work? Probably not.
Me.
Wait, sorry, everybody. I'm so bad. So stop share. Hold on.
It worked. That's
Melissa
it.
said it worked.
Excellent.
It worked.
It's good. Thank you. I would love to one of the things that the book is about self-invention or reinvention. And I'd love to the way that you write about it as being a creative act and tied to being a writer and an artist, I find both moving, and it's also very funny, you discussing how your body was not all together and the things that clothing does for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to hear you talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think I say early on that, you know, my head doesn't speak to my body. There's some sort of similar description at play. And all of a sudden, you know, I felt that, you know, my head and my body were lining up, but I couldn't invent myself without clothes. I mean, and I think that was not just an individual act. It was something that everyone did in those times. It was really important to construct an individual look, which wasn't a small deal because that was harder to do back then. I mean, you couldn't just, you know, go to Instagram or to some other source online and see like what the cool clothes were. It was harder to find and buy those cool clothes, and you didn't really want to look like what someone else was wearing. So, and it's, you know, the cool clothes could often not be bought in town. They had to be bought elsewhere. So it was an act that sort of anchored who you were in town with the larger world, and usually New York City. So yeah, it was sort of, you know, that self-invention was an ongoing act. What's kind of funny about those photos is that there's a wide distance between the look of, you know, my first arrival in town, between the picture you just posted, between like, I'm wearing like a leather jacket and big pants like a few months later. And then I think, you know, a few months after that, after a breakup, I have my hair stripped blonde. And like now, none of that, you know, it wouldn't really resonate. It wouldn't really signify, you know, in the way that it did back then. It's just, I know, it's so funny. There's Polly.
There's you and Polly.
And
There's a blonde.
Yeah, we titled that photo Blonde Ambition. A period that lasted, you know, all of a couple of months because it was hard to maintain. You couldn't buy the special purple shampoo you needed to maintain it, because if you didn't use that purple shampoo, it would get kind of dreary and ugly. So you had to drive to Orleans to buy it. And I couldn't deal after 4 months. But yeah, the point was that just those gestures, those acts did not feel small. They, you know, those efforts to claim the self or claim individuality felt like, you know, they were up against just like the pervasive sense of emergency and mortality in the atmosphere.
I'd love to bring Oren in, because Oren and I exchanged a couple of messages in advance of this, and Oren said several times here, here's Oren about the time.
With my chipmunk cheeks.
Oren, one of the things that you said several times was like, he got it exactly right. I was there, and this is how I remember it. And what if you can tell us about how it feels to read that time again through Paul's eyes?
It was really something. You know, Paul and I were not in touch for a few years, and the book got us reacquainted. It's funny, that picture, he sent me that picture, which I haven't seen. It was, I think, your 30th birthday?
Somewhere around there. It was the first summer I was in town. It was at your house.
So the funny thing is, I have that shirt, and I haven't worn it probably since, and that's 34 years. And I pack it up every year, and every summer I take it out. I say, I'm really throwing out this shirt. And for some reason, I can't do it. And kind of now I know why, because it's representative of a time and a place and a person. And Provincetown is a really special place, and it leaves its mark on everyone that passes through. It might be a week, it might be a series of weekends, it might be 10 years, it might be for someone as lucky as Polly for a really long time. But that when people say Provincetown, Provincetown, it's because it changes you. And when I moved there, it was the only place that ever felt like home. And it still feels that way for me. And I think for people that even when they passed through and left, Provincetown always is that place, it's home. When I read the book, there was a passage I remember about the moonlight on the architecture. And I thought, oh my God, he got it exactly right. That's exactly what it looks like. And I think of Paul's book as like a painting, that those of us that are artists move here for that sense of the light, and you try to get the light exactly right. Paul got the light exactly right, but he put it in words and not paint. And when I read it, it was so visual and it brought back so much. For me, it was unpacking a whole part of life. And I realized that Paul had observed everything. He heard everything and he forgot nothing, to the good and the bad. But it brought back that time. But the funny thing about it is it's not a nostalgic book. It's a book about a time and a place that's special. We were young, we were living in Provincetown. It was a terrible time and it was a wonderful time. We were in the middle of the HIV epidemic, but we were also, as Paul said, finding our identities, discovering who we were. And I think finding the courage to fall in love and find joy and heartbreak and ourselves and our lives all at the same time. And that's something that's happening every day. And still people come to Provincetown for, and it's part of being young. So the book, though it's nostalgic for me, it's not a nostalgic book, and it has something for everyone young to read and say, that's me, that's exactly right. Paul's observations are so honest and true that he looks inward and looks outward in a way that allowed me to look inward and outward again. And I'm really grateful for that time. And it was so much to unpack. And it's just, I'm looking at you right here on the screen, and I can just say to you, it's such a beautiful book. And I've read so many books about Provincetown and so many books about being young. And this just captured so much that seems so true and so direct. And I know that as an artist, that doing that is a really hard thing to do, and it takes a lot out of you. And you gave that to us, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Oren. That's no one could say anything lovelier.
I think it's absolutely, Oren, I loved everything that you said, and I think it's absolutely true that even though it's a book about the past, it does not feel nostalgic. It feels so immediate, and that my experience of reading it was sort of dropping back in time. And I'm also, because to me it reads like music, and I hadn't thought about the visual part of it. And I know Paul is a musician, and I think we've talked in other places about thinking about music and writing. But what is I'm interested both in how you think about getting the visual on the page, but also you came to Provincetown and you met Oren and Polly and other visual artists, and the change you think you had on your work.
Oh, that change felt huge, because I think up until that time, my only conversations and collaborations had been with, well, first when I was younger with other musicians, and then with other writers as part of, grad school and workshop. And, after a few years of the culture of being with other writers, I didn't really know that there might have been another world that was missing, another world that might have, or in fact did cause me to, interrogate my own standards. I know that sounds pretentious, but I remember it was different to read my work in the common room when the visual writers were in the room. And I knew that the visual writers did not care so much about whether a story was published in the New Yorker or was part of a book that had a contract from FSG. They cared about whether something was like dynamic and risky and had a strong visual suggestion. So, you know, the possibility of those imaginative collaborations really, you know, cracked open my work. I mean, I think there's a part of me, aside from being a frustrated musician, that's likely a frustrated visual artist. And I care a lot about engraving an image on the page that manages to saturate the reader's consciousness after he or they have put the book aside. And, you know, I care about what colors are on the page. You know, I want there to be, you know, if there's a red on the page, it has to dialogue with another color on the page, for instance. And it's all, you know, pretty idiosyncratic and not systematic and intuitive. But yeah, I want the work to have a visual impression. I want it to have a sonic impression. And I want it to have the energy of, you know, a good story, and you know, the inquiry of the essay. I want all these things to be at play at once.
I like you. I don't know if you realize this, but you referred to the visual artists as the visual writers.
Oh, I did. I did. I'm so. Leave it to me. How many things come out of my mouth that are? Well, they are visual writers, right?
Great compliment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Call us visual writers.
Like Polly is. I haven't read Oren's writing so much. But Polly is an amazing writer. I mean, an amazing descriptive writer in her emails. I actually put a little section from one of her emails in the book because it was so absolutely right. And yeah, she has a kind of canny way of seeing that, you know, does the kind of work that feels like it's in kinship with her own eye.
I'm gonna put up a picture of you and Polly.
Yes, I think, where are we, Polly? Is it some visitor center under construction? What?
I think it's in Connecticut someplace.
Oh, Connecticut.
Remember that weird?
Oh, we took a trip with Richard. Like,
I had a show in your bed.
It's funny that all of our pictures, like most of our pictures from that time, come from our dumb little trips outside of town. Like, no one thought to photo document, you know, our lives in town because it would have felt pretentious.
There you
So
are.
there we are at the Cape Cod Mall at like the ear piercing place. That's Polly, looking kind of Jane Fonda-ish, and there's the visual artist Portia Munson, and I think I'm about to get pierced in the earlobe and looking frozen.
Polly,
But, yeah.
Thanks for making that distinction of what you were having pierced.
I know.
you went to the Cape Cod Mall for certain piercings, and you could stay in town for different.
Exactly. But it was like funny that like the strange did not happen in town. Like after being in town for a while, the strange took place out in the real world, out in the Cape Cod Mall or in front of the Pancake Man in Yarmouth or in Connecticut.
Polly, I'd love to, besides the fact that I have to show the picture of Paul at the Pancake Man.
Oh yeah.
But before while I get that ready, will you talk about, I saw you responding immediately to the question of the visual artist didn't care about whether you were published in the New Yorker. And I'd love to hear about your experience coming to Provincetown as a visual artist and what it meant to be there with writers as well. What writers and artists get from each other, but particularly in a place like Provincetown.
I think one of the things that I've always actually find myself hanging around with writers as much as sometimes they're more than visual artists. And I have this theory about aesthetic tribes where doesn't matter what your medium is, but you're a member of certain aesthetic tribes, whether they're musicians or artists or, I don't know if you know what I mean. I mean, yeah, you know what I mean. But I think one of the amazing things, I've always been a reader, an avid reader and verbal, and the intimacy of, one of the things about moving, when I came to Provincetown, it was before I was a fellow at the Work Center. And back then, there were all these famous artists, older artists that were still alive, and writers. And like Stanley Kunitz lived at one end of town, Norman Mailer lived at another end of town. My favorite, the guy Al Jaffe, because I was a huge Mad Magazine fan, lived in town. And then like Raphael Sawyer. I mean, the list of artists and writers go on. So it was, to me, it was like being around movie stars. I mean, better than movie stars. And so the thing that's amazing about this town is you'd go to an art opening in the summer, and I know Oren, everyone who's been here knows this. You go to an art opening in the summer, and you'd go to the same opening in New York, and it would be everybody dressed in black and really nervous and holding cocktails. The same people are at an opening or a reading in Provincetown, and they've got sand all over themselves and like a wet shirt from being in the water, and their dog is with them, and they're like famous, accomplished people. But you're the thing is, like, the thing they say about the artists and the fishermen, like drinking in the bars together. That's what it was like when I moved here. It's like everybody was sort of together. We were all in the same level, and you know, I mean, one day, here's a good example. This is more recent, but a friend of mine has a shop, and he had this amazing desk. And I saw Michael Cunningham and Tony Kushner looking at this desk. And they both wanted to buy it. And I was watching that. Where else can you stand around watching two Pulitzer Prize winners, like, discussing the merits of a desk? And the casual, and it was just, so what that means is that the sort of stew that it makes, it's so casual and so intimate. And I was thinking about how, like, the readings at the Work Center, I don't know if they're really like this now, but one of the best things, and also about shows, visual artists, is that people try their experimental work that they would never make and put in a gallery in New York would look at. They're like, some people are like that, but when I was a fellow, every one of us did like weird work that was experimental. And so oftentimes you'll go to a reading and you'll hear people say, okay, this is new. I've never read this anywhere before. And you don't hear, I mean, because the audiences are so smart and so sensitive, and the visual people, and I'm not articulating it very well, but it's a very, very unusual place. I just feel so frigging lucky that I'm here, and that I got to experience that really in its heyday.
Your theory about aesthetic tribes, it feels like Provincetown is the place that brings people who would be all across the country so that they can be tribal together.
It's always been like that. I think it's the birthplace of American modernism. I really do. I think maybe other people have said the same thing, but when you look at old newspapers and see who was here at the same time.
I'm trying to say whether I want to,
huh? Oh.
I think there was a little, my internet connection is apparently
unclear. I'm sorry. So if you look at who was here attending cocktail parties and dinner parties, I mean, fashion designers, writers, authors, socialists, all like mingling together, men and women, dogs, I don't know. And so it's a very, it's, Petri dish doesn't seem right, but it's like a, metaphysical, yeah, so.
I'd love to, I have other questions. I'd love to invite people. There's one question already in the chat, but I'd also like to ask Oren and Polly if they have any questions for Paul about the book. We can ask another one.
You talked about how you first started it as I'm trying to remember what you said was that you made this big switch to have it be in the present rather than be something that you wrote about the past. And I find that the whole issue of time really interesting. So how did you decide how to set it when you did to make it present tense, to go from back and forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought the past tense, while it sounded, pleasing and convincing, led me to a kind of narrative that was leading toward resolution. It felt, I could feel the machine of it moving somewhere, and it all felt a little neat because, essentially I wanted the book to enact, or to at least imply the long-term consequences of HIV and AIDS on the psyche of generations of queer people. And I knew that that had to find a form that wasn't neat. So, how I went about doing that was just, I had to sort of pull the book apart. I mean, I wanted it to contract and expand. I wanted there to be sections that sort of worked on the page or resonated like poems. Like, I'm thinking of the section you just raised, like the moon on the harbor and its transformation of the harbor is an act that's not carried by narrative, but it like lives outside of calendar linear time. And I wanted to make sure that the book was capturing all the multiple senses of time that one experiences in town. Of course, we do experience narrative in town. Oh, I have to be at Polly's house at 9, or 5, we're going to an opening at 6. But, you can also walk down the street and see the way the moon works on the harbor, and you're not actually in clock time anymore. It's like you've walked inside a poem. So I just had to mess it up a little bit and make sure that the reader would trust what I was up to. I mean, part of that involved calling attention, doing a little mini essay about the multiple senses of time in town. Early on, there's, a little inquiry or section about the difference between clock time and like lyrical time and lateral time. And I thought, oh, if I give the reader this clue, the reader's going to figure out how this book is to be read and how it might be different from a more straightforward historical account of this place. I knew that my contribution could be, I could do something to capture Provincetown sense of time, Provincetown sense of community on an emotional level. I wanted to capture how it felt. And this was after trying, for a while to get all the facts down. And I like, oh, and this is not, that's for someone else to do. There's nothing wrong with that book. But I wanted, I wanted to write a book that didn't colonize the town, that wasn't the one book of Provincetown, but took its part or took as its project to write one particular person's way of seeing, hearing, feeling, touching, all of that.
Wow, that's so good. I mean, the older I get, the more I sort of think of time as being not a sequence, but on an ellipse.
Yeah.
It really captures something that I remember happening, like so crystal clear that 35 years ago was yesterday. But last week I can't really remember what I did.
Right. Yeah, same here.
It suspends time in a way that's really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna, speaking of suspending time,
man,
is
that still exists. I don't know what I'm performing for Polly. Like, it seems like all of these photos are in some way a performance of an inner joke.
Paul, I have one more question for you, and then I'm gonna read a couple of questions from the chat. And I think if this is your third book of memoir, and I know you're working on another one, and what's thrilling about them is that each book, from Famous Builder to The Narrow Door to this, feel different and are different. And this one feels much more personal and revelatory. And I'm really curious about whether, when you were writing in that mode, are you thinking about the general reader and how people will read it? And also when you're reading about actual people who you know will read the book or might read the book, how do you think about their interpretation, or do you go into your own interpretation and put aside all other possible ones?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think that the second one was so powerful, I almost forget what the first one was, like the first half.
Answer the second one.
The second one, well, it's the book, the first draft of the book, even though I tried different iterations of this book for years, all the way back to 1998 when I tried it out as a novel, but this particular iteration started about 5 weeks after my father died, and I was at an artist colony, and I had to make sure I wasn't in pain too much or hurting too much. I needed a project. And so I was probably more porous than I knew. And I wasn't really thinking about many people looking at the book at that time. And gradually, a book always develops a life of its own. And you look down at it, assemblage of 80 pages, and you think, oh my God, why did you write about that? And for me, I know there are other writers who will say, I can't put that out, but there comes a point where I feel like I have to honor and respect what the work wants to do. It's like it becomes less my story and the reader's story. My hope is that the reader steps into the skin of the I and, applies his own experiences to that I. The question of real people reading the book is super complicated, and it's something I think about. The real people who are in the book, and they're reading it, and their friends reading it, is, it's fraught to me, and it's something that I think about from sentence to sentence and don't have an axiom about it. I know I don't write about anyone whom I don't love in some way. Even if like a person is I've had a tough history with, there still has to be love in myself for that person. And I recently read a tweet by Therese Milet, the writer, and she said, if you're, as a memoirist, you're writing about other people, I would never give an axiom or pronouncement like this, but I thought this was smart and sensitive. She said, she gave three little rules, the first of which was represent that person with at least one trait they'd like to see themselves as being represented, as representative of their character. And the second one is that the the person who's writing the book should be as hard on himself as he might be on the character, that you can't, exercise your power over the person you write about, and, have to leave room for questions and your own blind spots. And I forget the third. I don't know why I'm not remembering the third. She's, the thing that surprised me was that she says, don't show those people the draft until you finish the book. So I thought it was a really smart little cluster of instructions, because she's simultaneously telling the writer, to honor your own truth, but also at the same time, pay attention to that other person's way of being in the world, how she sees herself.
Polly, because you're in this book. Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. And I didn't get a chance to ask you if you had a question for Paul, but also,
Well, I actually looked at the questions people have, and it's 6:46, and I wanted him to answer these questions.
Okay.
What other people had, because he and I, every question I've had, I asked him while he was writing it.
Excellent.
Off the hook, Polly.
From Ron Geigel, can Paul speak to the book's title? Why did he choose it? Were others in the running?
I usually have titles early on in the life of my books. I mean, I knew The Narrow Door was The Narrow Door maybe 2/3 of the way in the writing of the book, and it was never not that. And with this one, it was harder. And I think I wanted something that had some space around it, that wasn't too visual or emblematic. This might be my first title that isn't a noun, that doesn't evoke a picture. And I felt a little nervous about it. I mean, I like the offhandedness of it. I also think on a literal level, the book is evoking, I think it's the last hours of Bohemia, as grand as that sounds. It's right before the internet. I think, Elizabeth, you had the internet when we were fellows together, which I never saw. I mean, I never knew that you were on it, but
you could look up song lyrics.
Yes, but like most of us weren't online, at least people I knew, until like 2 years later. And the world changed once we could see how people lived outside of our little sphere. So this was a town that was making itself up on a day-to-day level. It was aware of the outside world, but it was also very much attuned to itself. If someone wore those pants, you might want those pants too. It's the final hours before, the final days and years before protease inhibitors. Like the world was right before Provincetown became a place of money, of overt money. So it's like later in the time period, in the long, elusive time period that existed.
There's a really lovely question that I think fits into this from Joseph Shapiro. You so beautifully capture the richness of a place that was gay. Gay neighborhoods are fading away. Some call that progress. I find it a loss. With your experience at Provincetown, I wonder how you feel about this. Is my reaction nostalgia?
Oh, that's another great question. Yeah, it's hard not to have mixed feelings about all that, right? I think about my own neighborhood here in Brooklyn, which I thought of as a very mixed neighborhood in the 3.5 years I've lived here. And all of a sudden it's become a gay neighborhood. Like all the time, I'm startled by this. Like I see couples and single gay men. It feels like, it's like it all of a sudden feels like Chelsea did when I lived there, in the aughts. And I didn't think that was exactly possible in, a world and time where it feels like most of us who are queer are sort of we're drawn less to separation. I don't think we're interested in that so much anymore. We, want to belong, want to more than belong, want to be in the center of the overculture or whatever word you want to use. So I'm not sure exactly how that relates to Provincetown. I'm fascinated by those places like Provincetown and Fire Island and Key West that developed at a time when they were removed, they were geographically removed and far to get to. And some of like the gay enclaves that have arisen since, like Rehoboth Beach or, Palm Springs, Fort Lauderdale. I mean, they're much more central. They're not in places of hiding. And so I'm not really sure what's next or where we're going. Yeah.
Here's a question from Leah Hampton.
Mhm.
Hi, Paul. Process
Hey, Leah.
question. This discussion about visuals is so interesting. Do you see the work as you're writing it? Cognitively speaking, are you a writer who sees what you're describing or what you're remembering?
I do. Yeah, I have to see it, even though plenty of this work lives in in my head and in the narrator's head. It still has to be ground to a room or a particular street where the eye is in motion. It doesn't work for me if I'm not in some way implying all the the senses that come from inhabiting a particular moment in time. I might not list all those senses, but I think as a writer, I need to feel them with the hopes that the reader's going to kind of co-create that experience. Aside from the visuals, I mean, I think like sonic stuff's really important to me now, and has become much more important to my sense of putting this work together. Over the last 3 or 4 books, I think, The Burning House is sort of like my outlier book, but I think I learned to do something sonically with Isidore's voice. I learned something huge there. And it has to have a particular cadence that sort of resembles the cadence of my inner life. It might not resemble the cadence of how I talk. I mean, I like shorter sentences in my writing, but I've noticed when I've listened to myself talk at events like this, it's like they're often not in sync. My cadence isn't in sync with my writing.
This may be related to another question we have from Bruce Cole. This book is rendered in short chapters that are almost reminiscent of fully realized beautiful essays. How did you land on this form to tell the story? And I wonder whether that's the section is related to the sentence, to the chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted each little section to feel concentrated. I really wanted the book to resonate with the reader, and I like the idea of white space and breaks contributing to that sense of whatever, like to resonance. So, I mean, I got a note from a reader a couple of weeks ago. I love this. He said that he first read the book he read it straight through in the expected way. And then he decided to read it backwards. And he said it made a different emotional current. I love that so much. I really wanted this to be a book that people wouldn't just read through once and put down and say, oh, I read later, but I wanted it to be a book that people came back to occasionally and picked up and read a section out of sequence or 2 sections out of sequence. So it could be read in multiple ways.
That's lovely. It does seem like a matrix in that way, not straightforward. Can I show a couple of last pictures?
Yes.
Because we're
how are we at 6:55? We could talk forever. That's in the Hudson D. Walker Gallery, 1993, I think. Like wearing the pants that everyone wore back then with my leather jacket. It's like really, it's like that's bizarre taste. That's deliberately testing something.
There are a bunch of pictures of fellows, which I loved. This one, which feels, this is your first group of fellows.
Yeah, that's the whole group, visual and verbal, 1991, 92. And like, look what my look back then. With my J. Crew jacket and,
This is why I never posed for photos like this one, because I don't want to know what
I know, like this is so hilarious. It's like a year later, I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in from the left, and I've become baby Leatherman within months.
This is the cover of that year's Provincetown Arts.
Yeah.
And we said we wanted to toast to Chris Busa, who ran that amazing magazine, which is going on for years, and who passed away a couple of months ago. And the fact that he would put a bunch of this ragtag group of people on the cover of a magazine, seems also very Provincetown. And then I just want, my favorite part of the book and my favorite picture. Mr. and Mrs. Binky.
For the parade.
Yes, my favorite too.
Have you seen that photo, Oren?
I haven't.
I mean, you can tell that damn cone is falling off my head already. I mean,
Oren, why is it your favorite? Because I know why it's mine.
Because I'm watching something that I could see, but was not visible probably to most of the people watching the parade.
Oren knew how distressed I was. I think that Oren's like the only person who told me, like fairly recently, I knew you were in such pain.
If you guys haven't read the book, there's this amazing scene in which Paul and his then boyfriend are dressed up as Mr. and Mrs. Binky, the mascots of a soft serve stand, and they're walking through the streets, and Paul is just furious the entire time while wearing this ridiculous hat.
Well, the hat it does not stay on my head. So it's about 2 hours of constant humiliation in the town that, I thought I'd always be completely safe in, and walk through its street, walk down its main street with a measure of dignity.
A measure of dignity. Paul, no one can live in Provincetown and not have surrendered their dignity for 2 hours or more.
One would rather a walk of shame happen at 2 a.m. rather than the broad daylight in front of all these stray tourists from the Upper Cape.
I think it's a beautiful moment in the book, because it is a moment of surrender.
Yeah, it is, I guess. That's a good way to put it.
Do you guys have any last thoughts, or our time? I can't believe it.
Polly, can we see Petey?
Oh, sure. Hang on a second.
This was part of that. People need to see Petey. Look at Alyssa. There he is.
There
Petey.
he is.
Petey. Yay, look at that boy. Petey, we're talking about a book in which you're featured.
Yes.
Well, it's a very oblique view of him.
Petey.
He can hear your voice.
Is he reacting? Is he looking for me?
Uh-oh, what happened? Oh, my fingers.
There he is.
Petey?
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 Sorry, you guys. He's just going back to bed.
So excited by our wonderful book. There he is, Petey. Petey. I'm so excited. Fine Arts Work Center book party. Oh, look at that face.
He does get excited when he hears Paul's voice. He gets up and he picks up a squeaky toy and walks in circles with it, wagging his tail.
Well, we could
do we have time for, well, maybe we don't. I missed a question about in the chat about the connection of that pandemic to our own pandemic.
Well, that's a good question too.
It is a good question. It's like it would probably take me months to unpack that, especially because it just still feels so volatile. I mean, Alex Chi wrote somewhere in an essay not so long ago is that it's the two pandemics are completely different in terms of everyday experience, but the fact still stands is that we're living in a country that doesn't care about the sick, that doesn't care about you if you're not doing well, and doesn't care, will erase you. So I mean, I think the experience of every day feels a lot different. By the time I arrived in Provincetown, it was at least 10 years into the epidemic, and we sort of knew, we knew a lot more about how the disease was transmitted, and everyday life could transpire in and around it, even though, our psyches were saturated by it. But yeah, this particular experience for all of us feels a lot different because we don't know the rules, and we have an idiot in charge. An idiot's too nice. Polly?
HIV was like that when I moved here in '86. People just didn't know. I mean, I remember actually being worried I could get it from a mosquito bite, wondering, and everybody thought stuff like that, like, can I get it from a mosquito bite?
Mm-hmm.
Tourists were worried that waiters would give it to them by handling their food.
Right.
Yeah, everyone was scared. Anyway.
And I mean, I feel like one of the things about our current moment and the book is that it's interestingly about precarity, and that life feels precarious at the moment. Yeah, we're up against an ending every day, and I think we're negotiating with that in ways that we're not even conscious of. We're in a moment of survival, and even if we feel that we might not catch the virus, we're thinking about all the people around us who are in precarious positions, and it's hard to be uplifting about all of that, but we get to do events like these.
But we also survived. We survived that one. There will be a life after this one, and you have some history under your belt, and you see that we do get through these things.
Yeah, and we get through these things, and people do a pretty good job of forgetting too. Like, the will to forget is such a human drive. Survival, yeah. And it's like that will to forget takes care of us, but it also comes at a cost too. I actually do think that that's one of the most moving parts of the book, is that I feel like I was there in those times, in the years that you're talking about, and I experienced some of what you talked about, although differently, not being a gay man at the center of it. But I'd forgotten it, and to have it brought back was incredibly meaningful to me. Thank you. Thank you. It's a really beautiful book. Thanks so much. Buy it if you haven't so far. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, Oren and Polly, so much. There's Kelly, who's reappeared. And Dawn. Thank you, Dawn and Kelly. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. I'm just so appreciative and so honored that you came tonight.
Thank you for such a beautiful night, Paul. Thank you for letting us celebrate this incredible book with you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you so much for hosting, and Polly and Oren, thank you so much for being here. East End Books here in Provincetown has copies of Later in stock, so you can order your copy online. They'll ship it nationally, or if you live here on the Outer Cape, they'll deliver it to you. Our next event is next Tuesday at 6 p.m., exploring the creation of the new Provincetown Print Project with participating master artists and printers. Thank you so much for joining us. I hate to say goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Sending love. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.